Bacon.
Thank you very much, Sir Charles. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I too would like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, for securing this important and increasingly topical debate. Because finding new ways to justify charging motorists to drive their cars is becoming increasingly fashionable with certain politicians in this country, especially in London. Just last week, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, announced a consultation on expanding the ultra-low emission zone to the Greater London boundary. And he claims, of course, this is to do with air quality and congestion, but it isn't. This is a map taken from Transport for London's website at the time that they were investigating setting up the ultra-low emission zone. And the colour code, which I appreciate you won't be able to see from here, yellow is the legal limit for air pollution in London. The redder or more orange it gets is the worse the air gets. The bluer or the greener it gets, the better the air gets. So as you can see, bad air quality is located in central London and around Heathrow Airport and some of the trunk roads into and out of those areas. Where it is not is outside the North and South Circular and in outer London. So what this actually is about raising revenue, Sir Charles, which is not surprising given the financial mess that Transport for London are in. Now, it is true, of course, that the pandemic hurt Transport for London. It hurt them grievously, and it wouldn't be sensible to deny that. But there were a catalogue of blunders that preceded the pandemic, such as the unaffordable fares freeze, which cost Transport for London, by their own calculation, at least £640 million, but likely much more. The failure to maximise the commercial revenue for Transport for London, and, of course, the complete mess that Sadiq Khan made over the oversight of Crossrail. The Mayor's TfL business plan was predicated and extremely reliant on the revenue that Crossrail was going to deliver if it was on time and on budget. But thanks to his failure to adequately scrutinise Crossrail, despite his role as chairman of Transport for London, which is the overseeing body, TfL is now short of billions of pounds of fares revenue that it would otherwise have raised. Expanding the ultra-low emission zone to the Greater London boundary will have shattering consequences for people living in outer London. Those with older vehicles, it will now cost them an additional, before they've even fuelled it or paid their road tax, it will cost them £4,500 to own one of those vehicles if they use it every day. Now, that will hit everybody, of course, but the poorest Londoners, those who are less able to replace their vehicles, will be hit the hardest. I'll be happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
Just wanted to challenge him on that point that it will hit everybody, because I obviously have some experience of the ULEZ coming into my constituency. And it is only for diesel vehicles and petrol vehicles over a certain age. And I do have to tell him I was worried about the impact, but I have to tell him it's been much less than I thought in terms of numbers of people actually affected. So I just wanted to raise that point with him.
She's correct. I mean, it will hit petrol vehicles that are 2006 or older, and the kind of people that will own those, as the point I've just made, will be the poorer Londoners. And it will hit diesel vehicles that are 2014 or older. Now, 2014 is not a particularly old car. I had a diesel vehicle that was 2012, which I got rid of the minute Sadiq Khan was elected Mayor of London, because I knew that this was coming and it would be unaffordable and there would be no second-hand market in it. So I had to, and I was in the fortunate position that I was able to afford to get a newer car. But many people in London will not be able to afford to do that, and it's going to hit them. And the point that I've made using this map is going to be hitting them completely unnecessarily. There would be a devastating hit on an economy struggling to recover from the pandemic. And the point I've just made is that there will be a devastating hit for no reason. And this is the thin end of the wedge, because we know Sadiq Khan's ultimate ambition is to introduce road pricing in London. He hasn't hidden that. The press release that accompanied, or the letter that came to every member of Parliament in London that accompanied the announcement of the ultra-low emission zone, actually said that his ultimate objective is to replace all forms of charges in London with a road pricing scheme. And the Mayor's transport strategy of 2018, which I will quote, says, "The Mayor will give consideration to the development of the next generation of road user charging systems. These could replace such schemes as the congestion charge, the low emission zone, the ultra-low emission zone. More sophisticated road user charging could be used to contribute to the achievement of the policies and proposals in this strategy to help reduce congestion on the road network and support efficient traffic movement." It goes on. "In doing so, the Mayor will consider the appropriate technology for any future schemes and the potential for future schemes that reflects distance, time, emissions, road danger and other factors in an integrated way." And in the same document, which is quite revealing of his thinking, he says this: "We must address the fundamentally inadequate and unfair way in which road use is paid for in London, with motorists paying too little and in effect being subsidised by public transport fare payers. Measures such as road user charging where appropriate, land value capture and devolution of financial powers to local level are essential in delivering an efficient and fair funding system. Well, I want to concentrate on the claim that motorists are subsidised by public transport users, because those claims simply don't stack up, Sir Charles. Setting aside the fact that most Londoners use a mixture of modes of travel and cannot easily be categorised as a motorist, a pedestrian, a cyclist, a walker, it's notable that at the time the strategy was launched, Transport for London annual bus subsidy amounted to £722 million. And in addition, Transport for London provided in excess of £318 million of concessionary travel across its network, taking the level of publicly funded subsidy to well over £1 billion per annum. By contrast, London's 2.6 million drivers were collectively paying £1.9 billion in motoring taxes. So I really don't see how he can make the claim that motorists are being subsidised by public transport users. It's actually very much the reverse. Now, for many people, driving represents freedom. And we should not be sanguine about the state seeking to undermine people's abilities to get into their own car and drive directly wherever they want to go. Owning or having access to a car can significantly increase individuals' travel opportunities, and road pricing is a policy that seeks to curb, undermine, or remove that. And there's a further point regarding freedom that I would like to make, Sir Charles, and that is, and it's touching on the point that my honourable friend made in his introductory remarks, the technology required to make this form of road pricing work would almost inevitably have to include some form of global navigation satellite system technology. In other words, there would have to be a black box in every vehicle that would be capable of identifying exactly where each car had been located at any given time. Now, that creates both practical and civil liberties considerations. In practical terms, there's a question of how this technology will be imposed on those driving in London, if indeed we are talking about road pricing solely in London. Currently, some British motorists choose to install a black box in order to get cheaper car insurance. But a situation in which this technology was mandatory would be very different indeed. How would the Mayor ensure that anyone who wished to drive in London had a black box in their car? Because Londoners drive around London, but people from outside London also drive across the Greater London boundary. So how would that work? Trying to introduce road pricing in the Greater London alone, rather than the whole of the UK, as has been touched on by colleagues, would be fraught with difficulty for that very reason. And in terms of civil liberties, there are many people who would be very uncomfortable with the idea that the state might be able to track their every move via their car. As yet, this issue has not been addressed by anyone advocating any form of road pricing. So there are significant economic, practical and civil liberties problems with this idea. But it's important, but its impact on people's everyday lives merits the highest consideration. If Sadiq Khan tries to force Londoners out of their cars by increasing the cost of driving, he will inevitably catch those who have little choice but to drive. Even if there are exemptions for specific individuals, for example, blue badge holders, there will still be ordinary Londoners who need to drive but can no longer afford to do so. For a great many of my constituents, in common with the Honourable Member for Richmond Park, and in common with my honourable friend, the Member for Carshilton and Wallington, a car is an essential feature in their everyday lives, not least because there are few genuine alternatives to many journeys. And in much of outer London, particularly in South London, the choice for those using public transport is the train or the bus, and trains are mostly a radial option. They are very useful for travelling into central London, but of little use if you want to make an orbital journey. Buses are much more useful for orbital journeys, but by their very nature, they're both relatively slow and often indirect. Many Londoners feel their car is their best option for journeying outside of London. And this is particularly the case when the public transport alternative would involve travelling into central London and then back out again. So again, road pricing, even if it's only applied to a London-based section of the journey, would increase the cost of those journeys without doing anything to improve them. So in conclusion, Sir Charles, it's not a surprise that the current Mayor of London would prefer to squeeze more money out of Londoners, and ideally outer Londoners, who are less likely to vote for him. Nor is it a surprise that he should seek to address this cash grab up with high-minded justifications about air quality and emissions. Such a policy is fraught with difficulty and has so many downsides that it should be a non-starter. But if the Mayor of London decides to proceed with expanding the ultra-low emission zone, or, worse, introduce per-mile road charging, then the government should step in and stop it.